Before we begin this week's Parsha podcast, I'd like to give the audience a quick update on my summer schedule. As long-term listeners may know, every year my family and I drive to the Northeast. We live, of course, in Houston. We drive to the Northeast and we try to spend a couple of weeks in Toronto, in Canada, with my in-laws. Kids could spend some time with their grandparents. We could get away from the sweltering heat, the oppressive heat of Houston. And this year is no different. We're going to try to head to Canada, please God, next week. Of course, the problem is that due to the coronavirus, the border between the United States and Canada is actually closed to all but non-essential travel. So it's not so clear as of right now if we're going to succeed in getting into Canada, or we'll have to spend some time in New York, which we were planning to do anyhow, spend time with my parents, various family that we have in New York or New York area, and then we'll have to head back to Houston if we are unsuccessful to penetrate the fortress that is our northern border, Canada. So I'll give you guys an update about that. But of course, that's going to upend my normal schedule. I'm going to try to do a Parsha podcast each week. I may be unsuccessful, so you'll have to forgive me for that. As usual, my email address is rabbiwalby@gmail.com. I look forward and I cherish your emails. This is an absolutely packed Parsha. I want to share one powerful, valuable insight that can be a lesson for us in our lives. So this Parsha, the Jewish people are about to move. We've spent almost a year at Sinai. Of course, they had the revelation at Sinai. They get the Ten Commandments. They have, of course, the sin of the golden calf. They've spent almost a year studying under the tutelage of Moshe. The cloud was enveloping them completely, and now it's time to move. The cloud is going to pick up, and the nation, of course, knows the various encampments, which tribe goes first, which tribe goes second, how you disassemble and put the Mishkan back together every time you arrive at a new location. We have all the instructions. Moshe made his trumpets, and now it's time to move. And the cloud picks up, and it's time to move, and the nation begins to march. So then there's a very interesting succession of events that happen. So chapter 10, verse 29, Moshe begins to lobby Chovav, which we find out is actually Jethro, his father-in-law. And he says to him, we want you to come with us. Of course, Rashi tells us the nation is under the impression that they're about to go into the land of Israel imminently. And Jethro, sometimes called Chovav, Rashi tells us he had multiple names, many different names. He is with them, and he's been with them for the duration of their time at Sinai, and now he wants to head back home. So Moshe tries to convince him to come join the Jewish people. And he tells him, come with us, we'll treat you well. When we get goodness, we're going to give it to you. Don't forsake us. And Yisro says, no, I'm actually going to go home. I'm going back to my family. I'm going back to Midian. I'm going to go back. I'm not joining you on this journey. And then Moshe persists. And he tells him, don't forsake us. We need you. You have been our eyes. You've been our visionary. And the story sort of ends, and they begin to leave from the mountain of Hashem, from Mount Sinai, and they travel away. And we find out that actually Yisro did leave them, and he went back to Midian to convert the rest of his family, and eventually they rejoined the Jewish people. So this is interesting. We find an entire dialogue, a narrative between Moshe and his father-in-law. His father-in-law wants to leave, and Moshe says, no, stay with us. And his father says, no, I'm going back home. Moshe insists, please don't leave us. We need you. It's really important for us to have you. You're going to be our visionary. You're going to be our eyes. We'll give you good things. He tries to bribe him. He tries to cajole him to stay with the Jewish people. Why is Moshe trying so hard to lobby Yisro to stay? Why is he so worried about losing Yisro? So that's the first question. So the nation travels, and then we have a very bizarre, a very unusual thing, that there is a section that seems to be out of place. And this is verse 35. If you look in a Torah scroll, and in fact in many versions of the Chumash, you'll see backwards and sometimes even upside down facing NUNs, the letter Nun, that makes the N sound, the equivalent of an N, you'll see two of them facing the opposite direction, and then we have two verses separated by these two NUNs, and then it goes back onto the narrative of the Jewish people. And the Talmud actually says that there are various reasons given as to why these two verses, verse 35 and 36 of chapter 10, why are they surrounded by backwards facing NUNs? And the first answer given to us in the Talmud book of Shabbos, page 115b, going into 116a, the first answer is because this is coming to tell you that this is not the correct place. This particular citation, these two verses that talk about what would happen when the ark would journey, and what Moshe would say when it journeyed, and what he would say, what Moshe would say when it would rest, actually, it doesn't belong here. It's out of place. It should have been written earlier. And therefore, almost like parentheses that tell us that this is a departure from the main narrative, and by the way, people have speculated this is the origin of parentheses, you put these two NUNs, one at the beginning of the departure and one at the end of the departure, when we go back to the relevant topical matter to tell you this is out of place. That's the first answer given in the Talmud. The second answer given in the Talmud is that no, the reason why this section, these two verses are cordoned off by two backwards facing NUNs, it's to tell you that you thought there were actually 5 books of Moses. Actually, no. This is its own book. These two verses are the equivalent of their own book. So in fact, there are 7 books of Moses. You have, of course, Genesis, Bereshis, and then Shmos, which is Exodus, Leviticus, Vayikra. And then Bamidbar, Numbers, is actually broken down into 3 different books. You have the book that precedes the first upside-down nun, and then you have the book that goes on from the second upside-down nun, and then you have these two verses, and that makes up its own book, which is kind of an astonishing idea. And the Talmud elaborates, and the Talmud says, according to the opinion that says it's its own book, there's actually 7 books of the Torah, and according to the opinion that tells us that this was written out of place, it should have been written earlier. According to some, it should have been written 50 sections earlier. And we know based upon the Gematria system that the letter Nun corresponds to the number 50. And that's why maybe some have speculated the reason why we have an upside down Nun specifically is because it really belongs 50 sections earlier. But the Talmud tells us that according to the opinion that tells us that the reason why we have these two symbols, these two backwards facing Nuns over here, it's because it's out of place, says the Talmud, in the future, eventually it's going to be uprooted. These two verses are going to be uprooted and going to be moved to their correct place. So ask the Talmud, so why indeed was these two verses moved from their correct place that belonged several chapters earlier? Why were they moved over here? It is to separate from the various punishments. The Jewish people are leaving Sinai, and they're about to make all kinds of blunders. And we don't want them to have a successive sequence of various mistakes. And therefore, they made a first mistake. And the Ramban tells us that the mistake was that they left Sinai gleefully. They were so happy, like a kid escaping school. That was the first mistake. And then right afterwards, in chapter 11, they start complaining and they ask for meat. And we don't want to have 3 successive mistakes in a row. And therefore, we take a citation that really belonged earlier, and we take it from the correct place where it was, and we implant it in the incorrect place just as a way to break up the narrative. We don't have 3 mistakes in a row. But in the future, it's going to be again uprooted from the incorrect place and restored back to where it belongs several chapters earlier. So obviously, if you read this Talmud, there's all kinds of questions that arise. What does it mean that there's this whole new book that has only 2 verses? That's such a strange idea. What does it mean that it's going to once again pick up and move back to its original location? So there's a lot of questions about this stage in the narrative. So what happens afterwards? Chapter 11 begins. The nation starts complaining, and they're evil in the ears of Hashem. Hashem heard, his wrath flared, and a fire consumes some of the people. So this is a mistake. Rashi tells us that the people start complaining. They don't want to travel, and they're punished right away. And then immediately afterwards, in verse 4, the rabble amongst the Jewish people, they start craving. And they say, we want meat. We remember the fish we used to eat in Egypt, free of charge. We had cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlic. They get nostalgic for the cuisine of Egypt. And they complain, but now our life is parched. There's nothing. All we have is this manna. We're so sick and tired of eating this manna. And then the verse goes on to talk about that the manna was actually amazing. It tasted fantastic. And the people complained only because there were a few foods that the manna would not taste like. The manna was elastic food. Whatever you wanted it to taste like, it would taste like. But there were certain foods, like cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. Rashi tells us that these foods were bad for pregnant women, and therefore the manna would be able to take upon the taste of all other foods besides for these ones, and right away this people start complaining about it. And then what's interesting is that immediately after that, Moshe has despair. And he's exasperated. And he tells God, "You have done evil to me. Why have I not found favor in your eyes? The burden of the people is too severe. Am I like a parent? Did I conceive this nation? It's too much for me to bear, the nation. I cannot deal with it myself. And if this is how you deal with me, kill me now if I have favor in your eyes, and don't let me see in my evil." So Moshe, because the people are sinning in successive ways, he gives up. This is an unconquerable challenge for Moshe. He throws his hands up in his desperation. He says, okay, I can't be the sole leader of the people. And the Almighty says, okay, I will get you some lieutenants. Gather 70 people. Moshe gathers 70 people, and they become the Sanhedrin. And these are the people that Moshe is going to outsource some of the leadership to. Now he has some lieutenants to help him in leading the people. So there's a few questions here. The nation, they sin. They run away from Sinai. They complain about the journey. They want to eat meat. They're sinning. But this is a nation that has already had sins in the past. They're complaining they don't have any water in Marah. They, of course, did the golden calf. Next week's Parsha, we're going to read how there's the sin of the spies. Moshe, seemingly, is well equipped to deal with a recalcitrant nation. But somehow, they make a request for meat. They complain about the food, and that is what sends Moshe over the edge. He tells God, okay, I can't do it anymore. I need some help. Why specifically is the nation's current behavior, why is that the trigger that forces Moshe to call for backup? Another question. In addition, Moshe is told to go find 70 elders, but he's also told the specific requirements of these people. God says to him, gather to me 70 men from the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people and its officers. What does this mean? So Rashi tells us that in Egypt, when the Jewish people were forced to work back-breaking labor, they would appoint overseers to oversee, Jewish overseers to oversee the workers. And then if the nation did not fulfill their quota, then they wouldn't go hit the individuals, the foot soldiers, they would hit the officers, the overseers. And these people, Rashi tells us, they had mercy, and they were hit on behalf of the Jewish people. And therefore, who was selected to be this supreme council, this Sanhedrin for the Jewish people? Who are these 70 elders? These are people that have some previous experience. They were hit for the Jewish brethren. They were beaten up by Egypt when the Jews did not fulfill their quota. So there's a few interesting questions. First of all, Moshe has a problem. The nation's complaining. They're nostalgic for Egypt. They want meat. They are disappointed with the journey. They are fleeing Mount Sinai gleefully. He says to God, I can't do it. I need help. God says, okay, the cavalry is coming. You have the Sanhedrin. How is the appointment of the Sanhedrin? Ostensibly, it is a group that's there to help in the jurisprudence, to make judicial decisions. How is that going to help Moshe's problem that the nation is pining to go back to Egypt? And finally, the qualifications of the Sanhedrin is somewhat bizarre. These are the overseers who were hit because of the unfinished quota of the Jewish people. Why is that the necessary criteria for being part of the Sanhedrin? So I want to suggest an answer that's going to explain everything that's happening over here and why Moshe wanted Yisro and why we have the backwards facing NUNs and why the people were nostalgic for Egypt and how the Sanhedrin is going to remedy that. What do the people say? The people say, we want to go back to Egypt. Why? Because we used to have good food there. We used to have the cucumbers and the melons, the leeks, the onions and the garlic. We know what happened to the Jewish people in Egypt. They were enslaved. They were oppressed. They were beaten up. Is this enough of a reason for them to want to go back? These particular foods couldn't be ported over. The taste couldn't be ported over to the manna. And that was enough to make them want to go back to Egypt? Back to slavery? Back to oppression? Back to suffering? Here's the critical idea. Change is very, very difficult. People get comfortable in the way of life, and the status quo becomes king. And the reason why most people, they begin their life on a certain path, on a certain trajectory, and they don't change, and they don't alter it radically, it's not because they've made a decision this is the correct path, but it's because that is what is comfortable. The existing status quo, that's very comfortable. And change is daunting. Change is scary. Change is frightening. And in fact, the Midrash tells us that 80% of the Jews opted to stay in Egypt. Think about it. You're a slave in Egypt, working for Pharaoh, backbreaking labor. Moshe comes, he does all these miracles, and you want to stay in Egypt? What this is telling us is that the comfort of the status quo, of what you're used to, no matter how terrible it is, that is something which is highly appealing. Because change, trying something new, experimentation is terrifying. And 80% of the people wouldn't even take the offer of freedom. But then we have the 20%. And the 20%, they had the courage. And they made the decision to join Moshe and to march out of Egypt and to chart a path, chart a journey for their new life. But what happens? They spend some time in Sinai and things are great, but then they hit a little road bump, a speed bump. And suddenly the past becomes very enticing. We see this a lot, when people have, let's say, a relationship with someone who's abusive, someone who is insufferable, someone who's a bad person, and they leave that person. It happens a lot that people get nostalgic. People go back to suffering even after they've decided to leave it. The previous state of someone before they changed, the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, even if it was objectively bad, he presents it in the good light. People have fond memories of the good old days. Even if the good old days were bad in every way, there is a built-in mechanism. We call this the Yetzer Hara. There's a built-in mechanism for someone who's changed, who's adopted a new plan, to say, you know what? I kind of miss that. You have people that have been sober for years, for decades, and they're trained to know that you're only one drink away from becoming a raging alcoholic again. Why? Because the past is still exciting. It's still exciting. It's still enticing. It's still going to be presented by the Yetzer Hara with all the positives and none of the negatives. The Jewish people, they leave. They bought into the program. And now things get a little bit difficult. They get buyer's remorse. We wish we could have stayed there. There, things were kind of good. They were bad. We know they were bad. But the Yetzer Hara portrays the picture by highlighting only the good and ignoring and obfuscating all the bad. The enticement doesn't include all the terrible, painful suffering, the empty feeling of what it was like to live in Egypt, what was it like to be subjected to bondage. What were they thinking about? The leeks and the cucumbers? Oh my goodness. Onions and garlic. Oh, I really crave it so badly. That's what the Yetzer Hara did. And you know what? I assume that they were actually salivating when they said that. In their head, the idea of subjugation, of servitude, of enslavement, that was not part of their purview at all. That's what the Yetzer Hara does. Someone makes a decision, that in itself demands tremendous courage to do that. But even afterwards, the Yetzer Hara is never going to stop to try to get a person to revert back to their previous self. And the only way to solve that is to constantly remind yourself of why you made that decision in the first place. And how do you do that? You highlight how bad things were and how proud you are of your change. The Jewish people at Sinai were in a cocooned environment. They had changed their lives over the past year. They're studying Torah from Moshe every day, and they're moving further and further away from their previous Egyptian selves. Things are going great. But then they're about to leave. And Moshe knows they're going to face a tremendous challenge. And he realizes that he has the magic solution with him. Who's with him? Yisro's with him. Who's Jethro? Who's Jethro? Jethro, we know, is a former minister of Pharaoh. He was someone who was part of the elite, part of the aristocracy of Egypt. And what did he do? He abandoned it all. He abandoned the wealth and the prestige and the honor of Egypt. And he's with them. He's suffering with them, so to speak, in the Sinai. He's a great aid to the people. Look, even Yisro, who was part of the upper echelon, the aristocracy of Egypt, he would prefer to be with us in the wilderness than to be with the Egyptian pagans. And the nation's getting ready to leave. Moshe realizes that Yisro is their security blanket. He is their eyes, as he says. He makes the Jewish people see clearly. The Yetzer Hara makes people blind, makes people see only the benefits of sin, only the benefits of Egypt, but of course, not any of the shortcomings of Egypt. Yisro is their eyes. Yisro opens up their vision. Yisro is someone that when you see him, you cannot possibly make the rational claim, even the Yetzer Hara can't do it, to say that Egypt is better. And he leaves, and disaster strikes. The nation leave Sinai like gleeful kids escaping from school. And then we have this intermission of the backwards facing NUNs, and they complain about the journey, and they say, give us meat like it was in Egypt. They right away are triggered by the Yetzer Hara to say, I want to go back to Egypt. I remember the good stuff. I remember all the good food we used to have. And Moshe says, I need help. I need backup. Is there anyone that can eliminate the mystique, the appeal of Egypt? The God says, okay, appoint for yourself 70 elders. Who are these elders? Were they great Torah scholars per se? Not necessarily. Did Moshe need their help to teach? Not necessarily. But you know who these people were? These people were the ones who bore the brunt of the pain, the suffering, and the oppression of the Egyptians. They were the ones who were constantly beaten by the Egyptians. If you imagine what they looked like, I would imagine that these people were covered from head to toe with scars that they contracted over the course of their tenure as the overseers of the Jewish people in Egypt. We had Yisro. Yisro was our eyes. He was the one who would right away dispel the notion that going back to Egypt is a good idea. And now he leaves, and right away the people say, let's go back to Egypt. Okay, we're going to appoint new eyes of the people. In fact, the Sanhedrin is actually called the Einei Ha'eda, the eyes of the congregation. They're going to be the equivalent of Yisro. They're going to remind us how bad things were in Egypt and how faulty and ludicrous it is for us to want to go back. What do we have over here? We have the Jewish people leaving, and right away we have the backwards NUNs. And we said there's various opinions in the Talmud. It's not the right place. It's going to be moved back to the correct place. It's its own book. So if you look at the commentary of the Parsha on the Talmud in the book of Shabbat, he says something very powerful. He says that the letter Nun is associated with the word nifilah, which means to fall. And in fact, he points out that in the prayer that we say, which is part of the Psalms, we say Ashrei Yoshvei V'Secha, and we list the verses beginning with the letter Aleph and going all the way throughout the Hebrew alphabet. There is one letter that does not have a verse beginning with that letter, and that's the letter Nun, because the letter Nun represents nofel, to fall. So he says that the reason why the letter that was chosen is letter Nun is because, according to the opinion that says that there are various sins happening in quick succession, that is hinted with the Nun, which hints the fact that people fall. And then he adds, which I thought, even though it's not our subject, I thought was really cool, according to the other opinion that says that the reason why we have those parentheses, those backwards Nuns, separating these two verses, it's because it's its own book. Well, that's coming to hint at the fact, like we said, the letter Nun is associated with the number 50, that even these two verses that comprise an entire book, Moshe was not able to understand it to its fullest because every book of the Torah contains within it the 50 gates of wisdom. And even this book, the book comprised of only two verses, has within it the Nun, the 50 gates of wisdom, and Moshe can only penetrate up to level 49. Even though Moshe is mentioned twice in this book, two verses, and both verses have a mention of Moshe, still, nonetheless, he was not able to access all 50 levels. According to our insight, that what's happening over here is the nation being faced with a tremendous challenge. The Yetzer Hara is saying, go back to Egypt. It was so appealing, even though it wasn't. Maybe we can offer a new reason as to why the Nuns are facing backwards. What's happening over here? The Jewish people are facing problems caused to them by looking back, by thinking wistfully on their past sinful life. The Nun is about falling. One of the ways the Yetzer Hara gets us to fall, gets us to stumble, gets us to trip, gets us to go back to our sinful ways, is by making us look backwards. Look wistfully in the past, get nostalgic about the past, and he presents it to us with all the glitz, with all the sizzle and the excitement, of course bereft of none of the painful consequences, and can even make a nation liberated from Egypt to become pining eagerly to go back to their ways. Of course, the Talmud tells us that in the future, eventually, the Yetzer Hara is going to be defeated. In the future, the Talmud tells us, the Yetzer Hara is going to be slaughtered. What happens when the Yetzer Hara is slaughtered? This citation is going to be restored back to its correct place. Once the Yetzer Hara is not there, to cloud our eyes, we don't need the eyes of Yisro. We don't need the eyes of the Sanhedrin. We could take this particular citation and bring it back to its original location, and we won't need any more the lesson of the backwards facing Nuns. And this is a very powerful insight. One of the means that the Yetzer Hara gets us to sin is by making us ruefully regret our good decisions. You make a good decision, it demands a certain conviction. It demands a certain internal fortitude. It demands courage. But even after that decision is done, you're not in the clear. Like we said, the alcoholic has to know that they could very quickly spiral back and become a raging alcoholic once again. Jewish people, we left Egypt. We left the pagans. We left the idolatry. And we see how quickly things spiral out of control. Once they lose their visionary, they lose Yisro, they lose the person who reminds them of how ridiculous it is to want to go back to Egypt. Right away, they sink back, the Yetzer Hara attach to them, and they say, oh my, we need some garlic, we need some onions, let's go back to servitude. And of course, Moshe says, I can't, that's something I can't solve. I'm going to need to conscript the 70 people covered in scars, people who demonstrate with their own body, who manifest with their own body the terrors of Egypt, once people have these people now installed as leaders, that desire will go away. A very powerful insight to understand what we are facing when we are facing the Yetzer Hara and what we have to overcome if we want to truthfully change ourselves. Thank you so much for listening. My email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. I appreciate your friendship. I appreciate your support. And I look forward to speaking to you again, please God, next week.